From the Toronto Star, I'm Rudgy Mudler, and this matters. How do you help people when they think your solution is worse than their problem? While many think the best thing for people experiencing homelessness to do is to get them into the shelter system, many homeless people hate the shelter system so much they prefer to stay on the streets. It's a classic catch-22 situation. Homelessness is a societal issue that there obviously is no singular fix for. That's one reason why something that's happening in Kitchener is worth taking a closer look at. It's called A Better Tent City, and it's trying to tackle the problem in a different way. Liam Casey is a reporter at the Canadian Press. He has done a lot of reporting on homelessness and mental health issues. He is also a former colleague of ours here at the Star, where, in full disclosure, he became a great friend of mine and remains so to this day. He's here to discuss a very intriguing project tackling homelessness in Kitchener. Liam, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to This Matters. Thank you so much for making the time.
I love being here, my man.
So, buddy, listen, I want to really get to this very specific thing that we're going to talk about, but I do think we need to set the table. One of the biggest issues in tackling homelessness, in that, the seemingly obvious solution is the shelter system. But it's generally hated by people who are experiencing homelessness, and many of them choose to stay on the streets. I know you've been dealing with this in Toronto broadly. You've talked to many experts and also many people on the streets. What are their issues with the shelter system as it exists now?
Well, it's an old system that sort of warehouses people. A lot of people living there didn't really like it. They didn't have many other options. As we all know, affordable housing across Canada doesn't really exist. There are options, but there's just not near enough of them. There's backlogs literally everywhere. Toronto is a good example. And so one issue that people tell me that comes up a lot is they don't feel safe in shelters. Too many people. There's lots of violence. I did a story earlier this year where I got my hands on some data that showed assaults were kind of increasing significantly over the last 5 years. They really started to jump during COVID. So there's safety as an issue. The other thing that a lot of people tell me who live in shelters and have lived on the streets is that they don't like all the rules at shelters. So it's not as free as you and I who live in a home. You can't necessarily come and go as you please. There are usually curfews. There are lots of rules, surrounding, say, like drug use. Noise is a big thing. If you are too loud, you can get kicked out, and you can get kicked out for a day or two or banned. You can also, if you miss curfew, like you come in too late, you can get kicked out. So there's all these sort of rules that a lot of people just don't really like. And then we fast forward a little bit, the pandemic hits, and a bunch of these shelters are decreasing capacity for physical distancing. Also, a lot of people were just scared of COVID. And so all across the country, you saw people just fleeing shelters. And in many places all across Ontario, Canada, they started to set up tents, these little kind of tent cities popping up everywhere. So what people tell me what they like about living in encampments, I spent a lot of time down at all the various encampments in Toronto, and then including this, sort of unique encampment, is that people like the freedom there that they don't get in the shelters. And they also like the community. They feel like they have a community. It's like neighbors, and you become friends with these people. And, there is lots of drug use. Opioids is sort of rampant, and big risk with opioids is opioid overdoses. Fatal overdoses are through the roof during the pandemic. It's only getting worse. The drug supply is tainted. A lot of people I've spoken to are on fentanyl, which, if you take a little bit too much fentanyl, you can die. So they like the fact that there's community around when they're using drugs because, other people are around. If you overdose, they can call for help. Or at a bunch of these places, they all have naloxone kits, including the encampments in Toronto. And, everyone in Kitchener had a naloxone kit. So that's sort of, generally speaking, from my experience talking to a bunch of people living in these encampments, that's kind of why they don't like shelters and why they sort of gravitate towards encampments. What it really is showing is that people just don't really like shelters. And the pandemic sort of was the reason to kind of get out of them and say a lot of these people just have had enough.
Okay, so that's a good table setter. Tell us a little bit about A Better Tent City in Kitchener-Waterloo. Where'd you hear about it and what exactly is it?
I read about it, I think back in June, actually, after one of the raids at the encampments in Toronto at Trinity Bellwoods. I was there. And, I've done a lot of reporting on encampments in Toronto. And then I just happened to see this article, the local media in Kitchener, about a better tent city, and was sort of instantly drawn to it because of all the issues with the encampments in Toronto. All the police raids, and the city doesn't want these encampments. And then it just seemed almost too good to be true when I was reading about it. And then I decided to kind of look into it and decided to go for a visit. I'll take a little bit of a step back. How this Better Tent City came about is basically there's a few people there that just did it. Kind of like what the homeless people were doing when they just set up these encampments, all across the country. There was a wealthy industrialist named Ron Doyle who had made his money in an alloy casting company. And as he got older, became sort of a philanthropist, was a well-known sort of community builder in Kitchener. And he and a man named Jeff Wilmer, the former chief administrative officer in Kitchener, started talking about what they can maybe do for the homeless in the region. And then, meanwhile, there's a woman named Nadine Green who was running a convenience store, and it was next to a Money Mart. And so she had a lot of homeless clients kind of coming into the store. She started to let these guys use her bathroom. And then she started giving away some of her food for free. Word of her generosity sort of spread, and her store became a de facto shelter. They actually started to build beds, and Nadine would tell people, regular customers, oh, it's just art. It's an art show. We're shining a light on homeless, on the homeless situation, right? And, eventually the customers all dried up, and she ended up giving away all her food, and obviously ran out of business and couldn't pay for her rent, and then got evicted. And this became, a big sort of local story because, she was being evicted, and there's sort of this related court process. And meanwhile, Ron Doyle and Jeff Wilmer had been reading about it in the local paper and decided to reach out to Nadine after she got evicted, and they started talking about what they can do. Then the pandemic hits, and Ron Doyle and Jeff Wilmer are like, let's just do it. Ron Doyle owns a big event space that was shuttered for COVID, a big kind of warehouse sort of thing. And then he just went to Nadine and said, let's, grab as many people as you can. Let's get a bunch of tents and set up in the warehouse. So they just did it. Jeff Wilmer goes to the city and says, we're doing this. It's in an industrial area. Can you rezone it so we can have people living here? The city actually, says, sure. And then that's kind of how it began.
What did you go visit right now? What's it look like? Because it's not tents. It's more like sheds, right?
So I also have to say on Tuesday it moved. So they did this big operation. So what was there and what they moved to. So it is 39 wood cabins that Ron Doyle had bought from a Mennonite guy. And they're small. They have a bed, some kind of storage area. Some people have like armoires in there for their clothes, and it's powered, insulated, heated, vented. And so they're in kind of like three like long rows. And so it looks like a couple of little sort of small main streets, if you will, in this giant snow dump that the city uses in the winter. It's just a huge patch of asphalt. And there's also a store there that's in a trailer. And so it's locked, but it's full of food, fresh food, as well as non-perishables. And Nadine holds the key. And if you need food, you go to Nadine and she'll, go in and get you it. It's all free for the people living there. There is a tent, it has sort of a makeshift kitchen. There's a fridge, microwave, barbecue. Food is brought in. They bring in a lot of food. When I was there, they had this massive spread of pasta salad. People love the food. They said they even get steaks barbecued every now and then. And they've sort of let the residents kind of paint and modify their cabins. And some of these people are quite handy. So some of them have little porches they've built and, a little like kind of communal seating area. And, some of them are quite colorful. Some of them have like art painted, directly on them. So it's really quite a striking scene when you first kind of come upon it.
You said when you first read about it, you thought it was too good to be true. You are giving it a bit of a idyllic view here, but this can still be pretty chaotic, right? Like, tell us a little bit about that. I mean, they're allowed to use drugs here, right? Like, this is one of the things, the rules here are a lot more lax than the shelter system, right?
Yeah, so about 2/3 of the people use drugs, the vast majority opioids, largely fentanyl and pills. There's a little bit of heroin use. Some people told me there's also some meth being used. And, like I said, everyone's got naloxone kits. And there is crime. Crime's up both within a Better Tent City and in sort of the neighboring areas. I spoke to the chief of police. He said it's largely property crimes. So a lot of bicycles get stolen. And I had a backpack. I was told, don't leave my backpack lying around. This is a taker's paradise. and nobody really likes it, but most people are just stealing to feed their addiction. They steal something, pawn it somewhere, get some cash so they can go and buy some drugs, and there's a few guys there who are in jail. There's one guy I spoke to, David, really nice, kind guy, 32-year-old, but he got hooked on drugs and he had recently just got out of jail, spent 80 days in jail, managed to get off the fentanyl in jail, but then started using again when he got out. And so he was in jail for stealing stuff, like he fully admitted it. He's like, I just needed it to get cash, to buy drugs.
We'll be right back. Well, here's the thing. What about discipline issues here? Like, can you get kicked out of this thing?
Yeah, they've kicked a few people out. How they explain it, you have to be like really, really bad. So one guy pulled a gun on other residents. Turns out it was a replica gun, but that was enough to get him booted. They have this kind of ad hoc mediation process from Nadine Green, who runs the place. She also lives there. Her number two is a guy named Alvin O'Day. He works there as well, gets paid, also lives there. And so a lot of his job is, he says, he's taking care of the garbage. So there's a lot of sort of mediation, and there's a lot of second, third, fourth chances for these guys, but they will kick you out. And like this guy who had the gun, they kicked out, and they eventually sort of convinced him to leave. It's like, you can leave, just leave kind of quietly. Or if you don't, we will call the police. The police tell me they want the community to kind of settle a bunch of their own issues. They don't want to be too heavy-handed, and they need to come, obviously, if there's crime, but they don't want to be kind of called there for all sorts of different reasons that may be a waste of their own police officers' time.
You mentioned this earlier, though, but the majority of people here are really happy to be here, and because of that community support, right?
Yes, they all were like pretty happy. And, one of the people who works there, who actually works with St. Mary's Parish, they've basically donated a guy who also helps run the place. He was sort of saying that you can kind of see over time, someone might come in and they're really amped up, like an 8.5 or 9 on the aggressive scale. And over time, they kind of just decrease a little bit or even more. And Nadine Green, who runs the place, really believes that you can sort of love these people to become better. She would keep saying, I like to hug the wicked out of them. I love them all. She says, I love them all, even the bad ones. And you can see, like, she is really the glue that kind of keeps this place together. And she has a way to kind of solve a lot of problems. For one example, somebody will kick the crap out of their home, break a bunch of windows, and then she'll be like, well, okay, clean it up. If you clean all this up, we'll give you $10. 5 minutes later, it's cleaned up. And so there's things like that.
In your story, you mentioned that other communities are looking into this. I'm curious about that, but also, what are the barriers to replicating this? I mean, from your story, it sounds like you need someone amazing like Nadine Green, who honestly sounds like the Mother Teresa of Kitchener.
Yeah, I think you sort of need someone like that. Like her number two is pretty good there, Alvin. Like, there are people out there, I think, that do it, but you're exactly right. You need that sort of caring person that has a real high threshold for a bunch of crap and is really kind of leading with their heart. So that, I think, is crucial. It can be replicated. The city of Kingston just passed a motion at council saying they're going to start to accept proposals. They also accepted a $150,000 gift, and it's definitely doable. Jeff Wilmer, who is the co-founder, he's had discussions with a group from Peterborough and a group from Woodstock. There's certainly interest out there. It seems to me to be a doable project financially. They take a portion of everyone's either Ontario Works or the ODSP check, that if you lived in a shelter, that a portion of your check goes directly to the shelter. And that ranges somewhere between $400 and $540 a month. And so they say that money at a Better Tent City covers operating costs. And then they have community donations that cover capital costs. And they say it's gone so well that they haven't had to do any sort of organized fundraising campaign, just through word of mouth. So there's a lot of people who just believe in the project and will give money. And it's definitely doable. And back to Kingston, so they're looking at it as well. Like, I was down in Kingston last year, and they had, a smaller encampment compared to, say, Toronto. But I think I counted like about 40 people there when I was there a year ago, and it was an issue. They ended up clearing that encampment. And with winter coming, like, winter's a very tough time to be living on the streets. And so a lot of these people are looking at these small cabins as sort of a stopgap until affordable housing can get built. There's this rapid housing initiative from the federal government, but that could be 3-5 years before those are even ready. So this is a problem that's happening now. And if you want to do something quick about it, this is a way to kind of quickly do it and everyone I've talked to likes the setup. So it seems to be one potential interim solution.
Liam, this is one of the most positive things I've read on this file in a really long time. The surprising thing to me is that there's buy-in from the community, even though there are issues like theft. Why is that? Is it because that they know all the people experiencing homelessness are all in the same place?
Yeah, so in Kitchener, they got support from both the police and the mayor and the local council. So I think that helps like hugely. There's not fighting. Like in Toronto, the homeless community and the homeless community supporters are really at odds with both the city and police. You know, that relationship seems to me to be fairly fractured. There's much more of a working relationship in Kitchener. And so I think that helps a lot. You know, police are going to come in if there's going to be crime. So if the community can kind of keep crime to a certain kind of level, you know, there's sort of an acceptable level. There are, you know, people aren't happy to be living next to these kind of people. There were complaints about people kind of going near parks that were close to people's homes. There's complaints of, you know, discarded needles kind of all over the place. Now, it is in an industrial area, but not too far from a residential neighborhood. And both the mayor and the chief of police were saying, well, you're going to have these complaints kind of everywhere a homeless person is. So what they said is that while there might be sort of a spike in kind of this property crime in that particular area, you know, what the chief of police said, they have reduced demand for a bunch of other calls. So they said their overdose calls are vastly reduced. Public washroom calls, so these homeless guys go to the washroom kind of just outside, those calls are vastly reduced across the city. There's a significantly reduced number of calls for trespassing, you know, across the city. So there does seem to be some benefits, at least from sort of a policing community safety, if you look at sort of the big picture and then the city as a whole. But yeah, it's not perfect.
Nothing about the situation is perfect. So I actually do like the fact that there was something that gave at least one community in Southern Ontario a little bit of hope, or at least sounds like there's a little bit of hope. And I want to hear more about the Dean Green woman and how hopefully she can hug the wicked out of these people, because that sounds like a great way to do it. Liam, is there anything that I didn't ask that you think our listeners should know?
So yeah, one thing I did want to mention. So one big complaint about, say, a bunch of these shelter hotels that have popped up in Toronto is that they're not near a lot of supports. What they've done in Kitchener is they've brought the supports to the site. So twice a week, this health bus drives in, you know, with nurses, social workers. And so I was there one day and the health bus rolled up and it was there, you know, most of the day. And I think there was a couple of people that would get dialysis, you know, right on the bus. And there's a lot of needle use there. So, you know, one sort of symptom of that is abscesses. So people will get their abscesses drained. You know, there's a wide variety of afflictions there. There's a lot of mental health afflictions. There are general sort of health concerns, you know, and it seems like a good way to solve the issue of lack of supports is just bring it to them. There is also a harm reduction sort of program going on there, where if you want to get off opioids, you can try methadone. So methadone is this liquid you have to take it every day. And what it does is if you then take fentanyl or some sort of opioid afterward, you don't get high. So it's a way to kind of get off the harder drugs. And about 12 people are on methadone now at the site trying to kick their opioid habit. And a pharmacist comes every day, you know, hands out the methadone. So there are advantages to having sort of a bunch of people kind of in one place if you can kind of organize and get the supports to them. You know, the city has assigned some housing caseworker to try to, you know, get them on the various waiting lists for affordable housing. And there's people there that will help. You know, a lot of people get their IDs and stuff stolen a lot, so they need help replacing their IDs. And so there's a bunch of supports that are brought to them that when you take a step back, you know, it just makes a lot of common sense. So I guess that's probably the last thing I would want to say. It's just they've kind of thought about a lot of things.
Sounds like another benefit to having a homeless community together. So, Liam, this is a fascinating story. I hope it's something that we can sort of continue to watch. And I really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thanks, Raju. Appreciate it, man.
Liam Casey is a reporter at the Canadian Press. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm your host, Raju Mudler. Our This Matters team is Adrian Chung, Brian Bradley, JP Fozo, Matt Hearn, Morgan Bachneck, Saba Etizaz, and Sean Pattenden. Our music is by So-Called, Mike DeAngelis, and Sean Pattenden. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com/subscribingmatters. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.